Hey folks, before I get into today's game, I want to touch on what I think is Exceed's most important fundamental, the high ground. If you have the high ground, strike. If you're equal, take the high ground. And if the opponent has the high ground, equalize. The high ground here is simply an advantage going into a strike. This is usually a boost, but it could be a specific range, position, or even having enough gauge for a strong ultra. Say one player boosts speed at range 3. The other needs to equalize or they'll be unfavored in the next strike. And this seems obvious, but in a game where you have as many different actions available to you as Exceed, keeping this fundamental concept in the back of your mind will help you find strong moves and have a better boost game. To expand on these points a little more, if you have the high ground, strike. In Exceed, you can try to set up perfect, unbeatable attacks every time, but the fact is that good players are pretty good at equalizing, and you're really going to struggle to set up a guaranteed win. If you can even set up a game state where the turn comes back to you and you still have the high ground, just strike and cash in. Next, if you're equal, take the high ground. Assuming that each attack does 4 damage on average, it takes just 8 hits to kill the opponent. When you have 60 cards to burn over the course of a game, you might as well turn some of those into extra oomph for your attacks. Lastly, if the opponent has the high ground, equalize. This is probably the trickiest of the three, as not only does each type of boost or effect warrant a different response, but you also have to have the card in your hand. This occasional straight-up inability to equalize that makes taking the high ground worth your time in the first place. Sometimes you boost and the opponent just can't claw it back. With time, you'll learn to sculpt your hand to keep good equalizing tools at the ready. If you're lacking direction outside of strikes or you feel like your boost game is weak, try keeping this visualization of the high ground in your mind as you play, and make moves that progress the game towards you having the high ground and then striking with it. I'll talk about this more over the course of today's game. I've kept you waiting long enough, let's get right into it. Today I'm playing a pickup game as Seijun against my opponent's shovel and shield knight. We've mulliganed and my opponent's taking the first turn. My opponent starts the game by boosting speed, which, in my opinion, already violates the principle of the high ground because the fact is, Shovel and Shield Knight starts with the high ground. One of Shovel and Shield Knight's greatest strengths as a character is actually from the Shield Knight half, which makes it so any attack that moves you towards the opponent moves you one space further. This gives you access to a really good mix-up right off the start of the game in the form of dive and assault, and if you really feel like beating a cross, you have discovery too. Boosting speed here does nothing except for making it so that your dive might be unbeatable on your next turn if you still have the advantage. Seijun, meanwhile, has no range 4 mix-up. She has dive and Inari guidance, and both of these attacks lose to a fast advancing option or trade unfavorably with a slow defensive one. That's not to say that you shouldn't ever try to set up perfect attacks, like what my opponent's trying to do here, but in this case, you can see that it doesn't work out for my opponent, because by boosting Heart of the Mountain, I completely equalize against both my opponent's character ability and the boost they just played. Finding that all of their attacks now lose to my slow options, my opponent boosts Cross to move into range 2 so they can once again threaten a mix-up. So here, I'm thinking my opponent's hand is 1 copy of Cross, 1 copy of Dive, and 3 mystery cards. I think my opponent's holding the Dive because otherwise the speed boost the turn prior doesn't really make much sense, and I'm thinking my opponent's holding Cross because, well, they moved into range 2, and Cross is the only thing that they could be holding that's still giving them the advantage from these boosts here. But I don't really have a way to equalize against a Cross other than parrying it, and I don't know, I didn't love that play. Here, instead, I elect to just prepare and consider myself equal on cards that way. Back on my opponent's turn, my opponent elects to simply strike, which I expected. And while I think this is the other copy of Cross, I hedge my bets a bit and just play my own, because I'm thinking, well, on the off chance that this is my opponent greeting, and they set a spike, or they set like an assault or something, I'd like to either dodge or trade, and I think Cross will leave me in a position that is overall more favorable. My opponent flips a Charge Slash, which is a fantastic mix-up with Cross here. If I had set the block, believing that my opponent was crossing, the Charge Slash would have absolutely destroyed it for a full 6 power. Instead, I get to hit for 3, run away, the Charge Slash moves in 1, and now we're back in neutral. The turn comes back to me, and I think for a little bit before striking. I actually have the high ground here because I prepared earlier. Because Seijun's kit has 5 transforms, she doesn't have much in the way of boosts, but she makes up for this by having access to Ink Spike and Ink Splash in her kit. These 2 attacks make it so every prepare action you take acts as a sort of mini power or speed boost, but for just those 2 attacks. We're in my character's favorite range now, and I can hit both harder and faster than anything my opponent can throw out here, so I'm just going to strike. As the game's just begun, I don't really have a read on what my opponent might defend with, so I go with the option that I think is the least likely to lose in the form of sweep, which can only lose to spike in this position, while still having a chance of being a big win in case my opponent defends with focus, dive, or block. My opponent plays the cross I suspected they had, which is more than fine. They've now burnt both copies of cross, one of their most valuable normals, so this is an exchange I'm perfectly happy with. At this range, there's not much striking to do, so my opponent prepares, I prepare, and my opponent prepares again. One way that a player can have the high ground over the other is by having access to really powerful ultras. Some characters have better ultras than others. Shovel and Shield Knight happens to be a character with an absolutely amazing ultra in the form of Shield Boomerang. So here, while we're far away and I've got the time, I decided to just parry a copy since my opponent just hit 7 cards in hand, and chances are okay that they've drawn one. My opponent did in fact have it, and at some point we're going to see if we can parry the other. Here my opponent has a choice to make. They can either move in themselves, or they can move Shield Knight in so that Shield Knight can use her associated specials to attack at range. My opponent elects to do the latter and moves Shield Knight 1 space. So I'm still fairly certain that my opponent's hand contains a dive based off their speed boost earlier, so in this position I can safely just give it a read, throw out a sweep, and if they have it, it's a free 6 damage and a free discard. Turns out they never had the dive. They reveal a hand with Assault, Focus, Spike, Discovery, Shovel Drop, the other Charge Slash, and the other Shield Drop. Presumably just to get the normal out of their hand, they defend with Spike, and both of our attacks miss. Back to our opponent's turn. They march Shield Knight forward. We EX transform Foxfire to make up space in our hand. Their opponent boosts Shovel Drop, moving Shovel Knight forward, and then as their bonus action, they move Shovel Knight forward again. Now, even though it looks like I'm cornered here, in reality, neither of us actually has the high ground. Because of Seijun's character ability, if my opponent were to use either of Shield Knight's signature moves, Buckler Blow or Shield Gong, I could respond with a 3-guard Inari Guidance and win. However, if I initiate with Inari Guidance, my opponent will always focus and I'll lose the trade. For that reason, I just prepared here to look for more cards. On their turn, my opponent takes the high ground by spending the Assault I know about to boost Charge Slash, threatening to break the guard on Inari Guidance with a 4-power Buckler Blow. Here, I make what I think now is just a really bad play. Instead of teching my opponent's boost and equalizing, I get this idea in my head where, if I strike, my opponent's incentivized to use a Shield Gong instead of a Buckler Blow, assuming that I'm blocking so that they can do more damage. Meanwhile, I set a dive, I close the distance, I move into my favorite range, they miss, I miss, but I secure the high ground from just jumping into my favorite range. What actually ends up happening is I just get hit by the obvious Buckler Blow, and it's exactly the situation I ranted about earlier. I just spent my action losing a strike I was not favored to win. On my opponent's turn, they read cross and strike. Because of the reading, I think it's likelier that this is another one of Shield Knight's special attacks instead of, like, a slow that's baiting an Inari Guidance. So I set the Inari Guidance, knowing it beats both of the Shield Knight specials and doesn't trade too badly with a slow. My opponent reveals a Shield Gong, we get a clean 3, and we're in an amazing position at range 2 against an opponent with no crosses left. Back on my turn, I overwhelmingly have the high ground. My opponent has just 1 card left in hand, I know it's the Shield Boomerang, and they don't have the gauge to use it. I strike with Yokai Banishing here because the only card that beats it in this position is Focus, and my opponent has already spent one of them. My opponent Wild Swings a Buckler Blow, which they choose to invalidate, and then finds a block. I choose to draw 2 cards and push 1, moving my opponent into my favorite range. Realizing that digging themselves out of this hole is going to require resources, my opponent burns their last copy of Shield Boomerang to get another gauge and draw a fresh grip. Back to my turn. I've got 3 transforms, I'm feeling fresh, I'm ready to exceed. I flip and draw Assault, which is pretty lucky because it shows up just in time to counter my opponent's Assault boost, using my Yokai Banishing transform. Through a combination of the sheer number of cards in my hand, my 3 transforms, and my preferred range, I currently hold the high ground over my opponent. Seijun has way fewer boosts in her kit than almost every other character in the game, so you usually have to use non-boost ways to take the high ground. I don't need to EX this Ink Splash. I think I just did it to put the Fear of God in my opponent. Either way, my opponent decides they don't like any of the cards in their hand, so they wild swing a dive, and we get an easy 5. My hubris is somewhat punished here because my opponent takes advantage of the fact that my 7-speed specials are down to boost speed and take the high ground. I equalize and even take the high ground back by taking the speed boost, and my opponent slightly improves their position by moving Shield Knight back to their space. Here, I respond in kind by boosting Cross to move to the center, which is Seijun's favorite space once she's got Inari Guidance transformed, since it lets her range 3 options reach the entire board if she needs them to. On my opponent's turn, they boost Tandem Attack. While I can't equalize against +3 power, +3 armor here, I can claw back some of the high ground by boosting Tale of 7 Trials, blunting the threat of being stunned by the bonus power. When it comes back to my opponent, they jump at the chance to strike with the high ground with an EX attack that I quickly figure out is EX Grasp. I consider blocking here, but decide I'd actually rather trade down with an Ink Spike and hold on to my resources. My opponent hits me for 7 and moves me to range 2, but because of my boost I'm not stunned and I can hit my opponent back for 7, minus their 4 armor is 3, and the game continues. When it comes back to my turn, I get deeper in the tank than I have at any other point this match. I'm pretty sure my opponent's hand is a Focus, a Tandem Attack, and some other card. I could try reading the Focus and striking, but if I'm wrong, the Tandem Attack just destroys me. Worse still, if they don't have the Focus and draw it later, I might not have redrawn a copy of Focus to counter it with Yokai Banishing, giving my opponent free reign. I consider parrying Tandem Attacks so my opponent can't boost it next turn, but I don't want to risk losing my block and letting my opponent parry the Focus out of my hand, clearing the way for a reading. It's very possible that's still the best play, but I think the line that I find here is a lot more exciting. I spend 2 force for +1 range and strike. Because I'd drawn the last card in my deck last turn, my opponent was able to solve for the contents of my hand. They knew that I was holding both a block and a focus, so they couldn't parry or read anything. They also knew that the only card in my hand that it made sense to give bonus range to was Grasp, which would make the tandem attack unsafe. My hope was, if my opponent was holding focus, the combination of focus being useless as a boost and my investing 2 force in a way that would only benefit a grasp would make it too tempting for my opponent to use the focus defensively here. My opponent mulls over the cards in their hand, picks one, flips focus, and I flip spike. On my opponent's turn, they take the reshuffle action to avoid making their hand any weaker to reading. On my turn, I draw a second assault and don't think twice about setting a 7 power, speed 6 EX assault, taking full advantage of the fact that my opponent just lost the one card that can stand up to it. If you think of transforms like Ink Spike as being conditional, harder to play boosts that don't go away at the end of the strike and can't be teched, you can see that as you reach the later stages of the game, it becomes very easy for Season 2 characters to take the high ground. Holding nothing in their hand that stands up to EX Assault, my opponent wild swings and flips a block. Normally that's a wild swing you'd be happy to see, but because that's their last block, my 4th gauge, and I gain advantage, flipping the block here is doom for my opponent. Spending 2 force for +1 range just in case my opponent draws into one of their crosses, I set EX Tale of 9 Sorrows. My opponent knows it's coming, so I just set it face up. They wild swing, invalidate an ultra, wild swing again, and flip a sweep, meaning my EX 9 Sorrows hits for the full 10 damage, winning the game.